There's a particular slant of light that comes through my kitchen window in the early afternoon. You know, it's a soft, buttery light that makes the dust motes dance like tiny fairies. It always reminds me of my mother. She used to call it baking light. I was just now looking for a tin of biscuits in the pantry when my fingers brushed against a small, wooden box I hadn't opened in years. It's where my mother kept her most treasured recipes, the ones she didn't write in her main book, the ones she knew by heart but kept on cards just in case. My hands, not as steady as they once were, lifted the lid. The box smelled faintly of vanilla and thyme, and there, right on top, was a small, yellowed index card. The ink was faded to a watery blue, and the corners were soft with age. In my mother's elegant, looping script it read, "Mama's sunshine, Keiko dear." Just seeing those words, my heart gave a little squeeze. I could almost smell it, the sharp, happy scent of lemons and the rich aroma of melting butter. That cake, it wasn't just a recipe. It was peace treaties and birthday celebrations. It was the cure for scraped knees and broken hearts. It was the one thing that could always bring my brother and me back to the same table. My brother, Michael. It's funny, isn't it? How you can share a whole childhood with someone, a whole history written in the same rooms, under the same roof, and then one day, you look up and they're a stranger. Worse than a stranger, really. A stranger is a blank page. An estranged brother is a book you once knew by heart, now slammed shut and locked away. This little recipe card, with a greasy fingerprint smudge in the corner, is a key to that lock. It takes me back to the last time I saw him. It was the autumn of 1975, a lifetime ago, in the quiet, hollowed-out house where we grew up, and we were there to tear it all apart. Our mother had passed away that summer, and the house, which had once been filled with her warmth and the scent of this very cake, now felt cavernous and cold. It was just the two of us, Michael and I, left to sort through the artifacts of our parents' lives. We were so different, you see. I was the practical one, the elder sister by 5 years. I suppose I inherited my father's sensible nature. I saw life as a series of tasks to be managed, of responsibilities to be met. I was the one who had stayed close to home, who had managed Mum's care in her final years. Michael was the dreamer. He had our mother's heart, a restless, creative thing. He saw the world in vibrant colors I often missed. He'd left our small town as soon as he could, chasing a vague, artistic dream in the city, always searching for something just over the horizon. He'd come home for the funeral, of course, looking thin and worn, his artist hands fidgeting in his pockets, looking like a guest in a house that was as much his as it was mine. The task of emptying the house was a heavy one. Every object we touched held a memory. Dad's old reading glasses, still on the bedside table, Mum's collection of porcelain birds on the mantelpiece, the worn spot on the carpet where she used to stand, looking out the window. For me, these things were sad reminders of what was gone. For Michael, they were sacred relics. The tension started as a low hum between us. I'd be in the kitchen, efficiently packing away the good china into boxes labeled charity or keep. I was focused on the job. Michael would drift in, pick up a single teacup, and stare at it for 10 minutes. "Remember when Mum dropped this and Dad glued it back together?" he'd say, his voice thick with emotion. "Look, you can still see the crack." I'd nod, my hands still moving. "Yes, I remember. But we can't keep everything, Michael. There isn't room." He'd look at me then, his eyes full of a kind of pained disappointment. "It's not about room, Ellie," he'd say, calling me by the childhood name no one else used anymore. "It's about memory." That was the heart of it. You see, I was trying to pack up the past so I could face the future. Michael was trying to hold on to it with both hands, terrified it would slip through his fingers like sand. The real storm, however, hadn't gathered yet. It was brewing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to break. The argument wasn't going to be about teacups or old photographs. It was going to be about the house itself, the bricks and mortar that had held our entire lives. I saw it as a financial asset, a responsibility that was too great for either of us to manage alone. It was old, it needed repairs, and it was filled with ghosts. In my practical mind, the solution was simple and obvious. For Michael, my simple solution was an act of unthinkable betrayal, and neither of us, in our stubbornness and our grief, was prepared to yield an inch. We were on a collision course, standing in the quiet rooms of our childhood, about to cause a wreckage that would take 40 years to clear. The next day, The air in the house was so thick with tension, you could have cut it with a knife. We avoided each other, the unspoken argument about selling the house, a silent third person in every room. I found myself getting angry at small things, the way Michael left his tea mug on the polished sideboard, the way he sighed dramatically every time he picked up another of our mother's trinkets. My grief was hardening into a brittle, defensive anger. His seemed to be dissolving into a sorrowful resentment of me. I decided to force the issue. I couldn't live in this limbo. I found him in the living room, our father's empty armchair, looking at an old family photograph. "Michael, we need to talk about this properly," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. He didn't look up from the photo. "I thought we were. You want to sell, I don't. Seems we're at an impasse." "It can't be an impasse," I insisted, walking further into the room. "We have to make a decision. I've spoken to an estate agent. He says the market is good right now. We could get a fair price." He finally looked up, his eyes flashing. "You went to an estate agent? Already? Behind my back?" "It wasn't behind your back, it was a practical step," I said, exasperated. "Someone has to be the grown-up here." "Oh, that was the wrong thing to say." He stood up, placing the photograph down with a sharp click. "The grown-up, is that how you see yourself, Ellie? The sensible one, and I'm just the foolish little brother who can't be trusted. The dreamer who doesn't understand how the real world works." "Well, do you?" I challenged him, my own anger flaring to meet his. "Do you have a plan for how to pay the bills for this place, for the repairs? Or do you just expect it to magically maintain itself while you visit once a year to feel nostalgic?" We were shouting now, that sound ugly and raw in the quiet house. Years of unspoken resentments, of feeling misunderstood, came pouring out. He accused me of having no soul, of wanting to erase our parents' memory for a bit of cash. I accused him of being a selfish child, of shirking all responsibility and then swooping in to play the hero of a story he hadn't bothered to live in, by the way. Dear, I have to pause for a moment. Telling this part is harder than I thought. My throat feels tight. It's strange how an argument from 40 years ago can still feel so raw. As I sit here, I wonder where you are, listening to this old woman's story. What time is it for you? I hope, wherever you are, that you are at peace. It's a comfort to me to know you're out there. Please, let me know in the comments below. It helps me feel a little less alone with these old ghosts. Now, where was I? The fight. It reached its peak in that dusty living room. Michael's face was pale with fury. "You know what your problem is, Ellie. You have a heart like a ledger book. Everything is debit and credit. You can't feel anything unless you can file it away neatly. Mom knew it too. She worried about you. That was it. That was the blow that knocked all the air from my lungs." "Don't you dare," I whispered, my voice shaking with a rage that frightened me. "Don't you dare speak for her. You weren't here." "I was here. I was the one holding her hand. I was the one changing her sheets. I was the one who listened to her cry at night while you were off in London pretending to be an artist." I saw him flinch as if I'd struck him. I had gone for the jugular, and I knew it. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "Pretending," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You think my life is a pretense? At least I tried to live one. What have you done, Ellie? Stayed here, getting smaller and smaller, until you've become as bitter and gray as this town." The silence that followed his words was absolute. We had said the unforgivable things, the things that can't be unsaid, the words that lodge in the heart like shards of glass. We had taken our grief and our fear and weaponized it against the one person in the world who should have understood. He stared at me for a long moment, his chest heaving. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. I heard him go up the stairs, the sound of a bag being zipped, and then his heavy footsteps coming back down. He walked past the living room doorway without looking at me, opened the front door, and closed it quietly behind him. I stood there, alone, in the center of the room, my body trembling. The ugly, hateful words we'd thrown at each other seemed to hang in the air like poison. I had won the argument, I suppose. He had left. I was the one left in charge. But as I stood there in the crushing silence of my childhood home, I had never felt less like a winner in my entire life. I had driven my brother away, and I had a horrible, sinking feeling that he was never coming back. The first few days of sorting were a tense ballet of avoidance. We'd work in separate rooms, the silence broken only by the scrape of a box on the floorboards or the rustle of old paper. I'd make us sandwiches for lunch, and we'd eat them on opposite sides of the kitchen table, the space between us charged with unspoken words. The house was a library of our shared history, and every room we entered held a different chapter. Up in the attic, suffocating in the smell of dust and mothballs, the tension grew sharper. This was the kingdom of forgotten things. My old school reports tied with a faded ribbon, Michael's childhood drawings, a wild collection of rocket ships and dragons, evidence of the dreamer he'd always been. He found an old, battered suitcase. Inside, carefully folded, was our father's army uniform. He lifted the heavy wool coat, his face a mixture of awe and sorrow. "I never really understood what he went through," Michael murmured, tracing the worn insignia on the sleeve. I was on the other side of the room, sorting through a box of my mother's old patterns and knitting supplies. "He didn't like to talk about it," I said, my voice practical. "It was his way. Or maybe we never asked the right way," Michael countered, his voice quiet but with an edge. "Maybe we were too busy getting on with things to stop and listen." The comment was aimed at me. I knew it. A small, sharp dart. I felt a prick of defensiveness. I had been the one here, listening to Dad's stories, what few he would tell. I was the one who had held Mum's hand. Where had Michael been? Chasing his artistic pipe dreams in London. I bit my tongue and continued sorting. The first major crack appeared over our mother's garden. It had been her pride and joy, a riot of color in the summer. Now, in the autumn, it was beginning to look sad and neglected. I was standing by the back door, looking out at the tangled rose bushes. "I suppose we'll have to hire someone to tidy all this up before we put the house on the market," I said, thinking aloud more than anything. The silence that followed was heavy. I turned. Michael was standing in the doorway behind me, his face pale. "On the market," he repeated, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "What are you talking about, Ellie?" My stomach tightened. I knew this was coming, but I wasn't ready for it. "Well, what else would we do with it?" I said, trying to keep my voice reasonable. "I can't afford to run it, and you live hundreds of miles away. It's a big, old house. Selling it is the only sensible option." "Sensible," he spat the word out, like it tasted foul. "Is that all you think about? What's sensible? This is our home. This is where Mum and Dad lived their whole lives. You want to just stick a for sale sign in the front garden and let strangers walk through their rooms. It's not their rooms anymore, Michael," I retorted, my own voice rising now. "They're gone, and we're left with the reality. The leaking roof, the boiler that's on its last legs, the council tax, things you haven't had to think about." The accusation was clear, and I meant it to be. "So, that's it. You resent me for leaving," he shot back. "You resent me for trying to build a life for myself that wasn't this." He gestured vaguely at the small town, the life he had run from. "I don't resent you for leaving," I said, trying to rein in my anger. "I resent you for coming back and acting as if this place is a museum that should be preserved in amber, with no thought to the practical cost. This house is a responsibility. I've been shouldering it alone for years." He looked at me, his eyes hurt. "I would have helped if you'd asked." "I shouldn't have to ask," I cried, the frustration of years bubbling to the surface. "You should have known. That was how it started. A crack in the foundation of our family, exposed by a conversation about a garden. It wasn't about the roses, or the leaking roof, not really. It was about two completely different ways of seeing the world, of processing grief." He saw our home as a sacred memorial to the past. I saw it as a problem that needed to be solved so I could move on with the future. He thought I was cold and unfeeling. I thought he was selfish and unrealistic. We were both right, and we were both wrong, and we were both too hurt and too proud to see the other's point of view. We retreated back to our separate corners of the house, the silence between us now thick with resentment. The battle lines had been drawn. After the front door closed behind Michael, the silence he left behind was a living thing. It was immense, a physical weight that pressed down on me from the high ceilings. For a few minutes, I just stood there, frozen, replaying our awful words. In my head, a part of me, the proud, angry part, insisted I was right. He was being unreasonable, sentimental to the point of absurdity. But a deeper, colder part of me felt a profound, sickening sense of shame. As bitter and gray as this town, his words echoed in the empty room. I expected him to come back. I spent the rest of the day listening for the sound of his key in the lock, rehearsing the cool, measured apology I might offer, or the stern defense of my position I might have to make again. But the afternoon faded into a gloomy evening, and the house remained silent and empty. He didn't come back. The next morning I found a note on the kitchen table. It wasn't an apology. It was just a few terse lines on a scrap of paper. "I'm staying at a hotel. My solicitor will be in touch regarding the house. You can do what you want with the contents." And that was it. No signature. My heart sank. Solicitor. He had taken our family argument and turned it into a legal matter. He had drawn a line in the sand, and it felt as final as a wall. A strange sort of cold resolve took over me then. If he wanted to be clinical and distant, then so could I. I would be the grown-up, just as I'd claimed. I would handle it. I spent the next few weeks in a flurry of activity, using it as a shield against the hurt. I called the estate agent again. I hired a firm to clear the house, standing by numbly, as strangers packed my parents' lives into boxes. I kept only a few things: my mother's recipe box, a handful of photographs, my father's favorite armchair. The rest was sold or given away. Every action felt like a betrayal, but I told myself it was necessary. The legal letters started arriving. Stiff, formal correspondence from a solicitor's office in London. They were all addressed to my solicitor, not to me. Michael had made himself completely unreachable. Through this cold, legal back and forth, we agreed on a price for his half of the house. I had to take out a small loan to buy him out, but I did it. I wanted it to be over. I wanted to erase the whole sorry affair. The day I signed the final papers, selling the house to a new family, I felt nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness. I had done what I set out to do. The house was sold, the assets were divided. Everything was neat and tidy, just like a ledger book, and I had never felt more miserable. I moved into a small, modern flat on the other side of town. It was clean and bright, and held no ghosts. I tried to build a new life. I had my job at the local library. I had a few friends. A year later, I met a kind, steady man named George. He was a widower, a retired schoolteacher, and his quiet companionship was a balm to my bruised soul. We married, and his gentle presence filled the silent spaces in my life, but the ghost of my brother was always there. Every Christmas, I would think of him. On his birthday, a leaden sadness would settle over me. I tried writing to him once. A few years after the fight, I found an old address of his and sent a short, hesitant card. "I hope you are well, Ellie." It felt inadequate, but it was all I could manage. A month later, it was returned to me, a big red stamp on the front. Addressee gone away. The years rolled on. George and I had a good life. We traveled a little. We gardened. We enjoyed our quiet routines. But there was always a missing piece. When friends talked about their siblings, about family gatherings and squabbles and shared jokes, I would feel a sharp, painful pang of loss. I had a brother in the world somewhere, but for all intents and purposes, I was an only child. The silence between us had stretched from weeks into months, from months into years, from years into a decade. I told myself it was his fault. He was the one who walked out. He was the one who refused my letter. Pride is a cold comfort, my dear, but sometimes it's the only blanket you have. I wrapped myself in it tightly, and tried to forget the brother I had lost. But, of course, I never really did. Time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of grief, but some sorrows it simply polishes, making them smoother, heavier, easier to carry, but impossible to put down. My silence with Michael became one of those polished stones in my heart. As the years turned into 2 decades, the fiery anger I'd felt was long gone, replaced by a permanent, low-grade ache of regret. My husband, George, was a dear, perceptive man. He knew the story, of course. He never pressed, but he saw the shadow that would cross my face whenever a particular song played on the radio, or when we'd pass a house that reminded me of our old one. "You could try to find him again, you know," he suggested gently, one evening, as we sat reading by the fire. "The world is smaller than it used to be." I just shook my head. He made his choice, George. The ball is in his court. But even as I said it, the words felt hollow. What if he was waiting for me? Pride is a fortress, but it can also be a prison. Life continued. I retired from the library. George's health began to fail, and I nursed him with a devotion born of deep, quiet love. When he passed away, the silence in my home was different from the silence in my parents' house all those years ago. That silence had been angry and raw. This one was filled with the gentle ghosts of a happy marriage, a profound, lonely peace. It was the birth of my first grandchild that served as the true turning point. My daughter, Sarah, had a beautiful baby boy named Leo. I went to stay with her for a few weeks to help out. One afternoon, I was holding little Leo in my arms, his tiny, perfect fingers wrapped around one of my own. He was so new, a blank slate, a fresh start. And as I looked at his peaceful, sleeping face, I was suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of all that he would miss. He would never know his good uncle. He would never hear stories about his grandmother's mischievous little brother. He would only have half a family history. And for what? Because of a house. Because of a few angry, prideful words said in grief 40 years ago. The absurdity of it, the sheer waste of it all, hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked at the polished stone of my regret and saw it for what it was, a self-inflicted wound I had allowed to fester for decades. My brother and I were not young anymore. We were running out of time. If we were ever going to mend this broken bridge, someone had to take the first step. And it was clear that someone had to be me. The resolve that filled me was terrifying. It was a leap into the unknown. He could slam the door in my face. He could refuse to speak to me. He could have passed away, for all I knew. The thought sent a chill of pure fear through me. But the risk of his rejection was finally smaller than the pain of my regret. When I got home, I began my search. It was a different world now, you see, the late 1990s. There were new ways of finding people, but I was from an older generation. I started the old-fashioned way. I wrote letters to the councils of the boroughs in London, where I thought he might have lived. I searched for his name in the public records at the main library. It was slow, painstaking work, filled with dead ends and disappointments. After months of searching, a breakthrough came from the most unexpected place. I was talking on the phone to a second cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, just catching up on a whim. I asked her if she had ever heard anything from or about Michael. "Oh, Michael," she said. "Funny you should ask. My husband saw him last year at a trade fair in Birmingham. He makes furniture now, apparently. Beautiful, handcrafted stuff. Said he had a little workshop somewhere in Shropshire. A quiet life. Shropshire. He wasn't in the bustling city anymore. He'd sought out the quiet life, just as I had." The cousin didn't have an address, but she had the name of his small business, Heartwood Creations. It was enough. A few more calls, a few more letters, and I had it. An address for his workshop in a small town I'd never heard of. I stared at the piece of paper, with his address on it for a whole week. It felt like holding a stick of dynamite. What now? A letter felt too easy to ignore. A phone call felt too abrupt. I knew, deep down, what I had to do. I had to go there, and I couldn't go empty-handed. I went to the pantry and took out the old wooden box. My fingers, trembling slightly, found the yellowed card. Mama's sunshine cake. I would go to him, and I would bring with me the only peace treaty our family had ever known. Baking that cake was like stepping back in time, the kitchen filled with the familiar, comforting smells of my childhood: lemon, zest, melting butter, sweet vanilla. My hands, which had become so used to quiet, solitary tasks, moved with a forgotten purpose. I creamed the butter and sugar, I beat the eggs, I folded in the flour with a gentle touch, just as my mother had taught me. With every step of the recipe, it felt as if I was stirring up memories, good and bad. I remembered Michael and me, as children, squabbling over who got to lick the spoon. I remembered my mother, her hands dusted with flour, humming a tune as she slid the cake into the oven. And I remembered the last time I'd even thought of this cake, in the cold, silent house. After our terrible fight, the cake came out of the oven, a perfect, beautiful gold, a sunshine cake. It seemed like such a fragile offering, such a ridiculously small gesture to mend a 40-year rift. What if he laughed at me? What if he saw it not as a peace offering, but as a reminder of the family he had lost, the home he felt I had stolen from him? Doubt was a cold, creeping thing, but I pushed it away. It was too late to turn back now. The next morning, I packed the cake carefully into a tin and placed it on the passenger seat of my little car. The drive to Shropshire was long. I'd never been a particularly adventurous driver, and the motorways were a terrifying river of fast-moving cars. I clutched the steering wheel with white knuckles, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. With every mile that passed, I felt further from my safe, predictable world and closer to a moment of reckoning. Shropshire was beautiful, rolling green hills and quiet, timber-framed villages. It was the sort of peaceful, artistic place that I could imagine Michael choosing. His workshop was on the edge of a small town, a converted barn next to a little cottage, a simple, hand-carved sign hung by the door, Heartwood Creations. I sat in the car for a full 15 minutes, my courage failing me. The cake tin on the seat beside me felt impossibly heavy. I could just turn around, drive home, and put the cake in my own freezer. He would never know I had come. I could go back to my quiet, safe silence. But I thought of little Leo's tiny hand in mine, and I knew I couldn't. I had to see this through. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car, retrieved the cake tin, and walked up the gravel path to the cottage door. My knock sounded deafeningly loud in the country quiet. I waited, nothing. My heart sank. Perhaps he wasn't home. I was about to turn away when I heard a sound from the barn. The big sliding door was slightly ajar. I peered inside. The air was thick with the rich, clean smell of sawdust. Tools hung neatly on the walls, and planks of beautiful wood oak, cherry, walnut were stacked in careful piles. And there, in the middle of the workshop, a man was bent over a half-finished chair, his back to me, carefully sanding a curved piece of wood. He was older, of course. His hair was completely gray, and he was thinner than I remembered, but I knew him instantly. It was Michael, but my throat was dry. I couldn't seem to make a sound. I must have made some small noise, a shuffle of my feet, on the gravel, because he paused. He slowly straightened up, wincing slightly as he put a hand to his lower back. He turned, his eyes fell on me, and he froze. His face, which had been peaceful and concentrated, became a mask of utter disbelief. The color drained from his cheeks. We just stared at each other across the dusty sunlit barn, two ghosts from another lifetime. 40 years vanished in that one silent moment. We were no longer old people. We were just Ellie and Michael again, standing in the wreckage of our family. He was the first to speak, his voice a hoarse, rusty whisper. "Ellie," he said, as if he couldn't possibly believe what he was seeing. I found my own voice, though it trembled. "Hello, Michael," I said, and I held out the cake tin. I brought you something." He just stared at the cake tin in my outstretched hands. He didn't move. For a long, terrible moment, I thought he was going to tell me to leave. I saw a flicker of the old anger in his eyes, a shadow of the hurt young man who had walked out of my life 40 years ago. But then, something else took over. His shoulders slumped, the tension seeming to drain out of him, and his face crumpled. The mask of disbelief gave way to a profound, weary sadness. "Sunshine cake?" he asked, his voice cracking on the words. I could only nod, my own eyes filling with tears. He took a shaky step forward, then another, and he took the tin from me. His hands, I noticed, were gnarled with arthritis, the hands of a man who had worked with wood his whole life. He didn't open the tin, he just held it, as if weighing the decades it represented. "You'd better come in," he said gruffly, gesturing with his head towards the cottage. His home was small and simple, but filled with a quiet warmth. Beautiful, handmade furniture was everywhere, each piece a work of art. There were books piled high and sketches pinned to the walls. It was the home of a man who had lived a quiet, solitary, creative life. It was the home of the dreamer I had always known. He led me to a small kitchen at the back. He placed the cake tin on the wooden table with a soft thud. We stood in an awkward, heavy silence, 40 years of things to say, and neither of us knew where to begin. "I'm sorry," I finally whispered, the two words I had needed to say for a lifetime. "Michael, I am so sorry for everything. I was proud, and I was stubborn, and I was wrong." He sank down onto one of his handmade chairs, running a hand over his tired face. "I was wrong, too, Ellie," he said, his voice muffled. "I was a selfish boy. I didn't understand the pressure you were under. I said terrible things." "So did I admitted, sitting down opposite him. The tears were flowing freely now, hot tears of grief and relief. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," he said, looking up at me, his eyes as blue as I remembered. "And I never meant to hurt you. I was just so angry at the world, at Mum being gone, and I took it out on you." He finally opened the cake tin. The scent of lemon filled the small kitchen. He looked at the golden cake, and a small, watery smile touched his lips. "She always made this when one of us was upset," he said. "I know," I replied. He got up, took 2 plates from a cupboard, and cut 2 large slices of the cake. He put them on the table, then made us both a cup of tea. We sat there, in his quiet kitchen, two old people with a shared history of pain, and we ate our mother's cake. With each bite, it felt like we were swallowing the past, letting the warmth and sweetness of it dissolve the bitterness that had lived between us for so long. We talked for hours. We didn't try to relitigate the past or assign blame. We just shared our lives. He told me about his struggles in London, his failed first business, his eventual move to Shropshire to find peace. He told me he'd never married, had never had children. A deep sadness filled me at the lonely life he'd had. He told me he'd thought of me often, had regretted his stubborn pride, but had never known how to bridge the gap. He admitted he'd received my letter all those years ago but had been too proud and too hurt to open it. I told him about George, about my daughter Sarah, and about my new grandson Leo. When I showed him a picture of the baby, his eyes softened. "He's beautiful, Ellie," he said quietly. "You have a beautiful family." As the afternoon light began to fade, a comfortable peace settled between us. The great, gaping wound of our separation had not magically vanished, but it had been cleaned and stitched. The healing could begin. That's the thing about forgiveness, my dear. We think of it as a gift we give to someone else. But it's not. It's a gift you give to yourself. The bitterness I carried for 40 years was a poison in my own heart. Letting it go was like putting down the heaviest burden I'd ever carried. Pride will build you a fortress, but it will be a lonely one. Love is the only thing that can build you a home. I speak to Michael on the phone every Sunday now. He's coming to visit next month, to meet his great-nephew. There is still a sadness for the lost years, for the shared memories we never made, but it is overshadowed by the joy of what we have found again. It is never too late. The bridge might be broken and weathered, but you can always try to build it again. Now, looking at this old, faded recipe card on my kitchen table, I don't just feel the sadness of that time. I feel the warmth of my brother's kitchen, the taste of that forgiving cake, the quiet joy of a second chance. And that, my dear, is a recipe worth keeping.